Hello and welcome back to the EMJ GOLD podcast, brought to you by EMJ, your number one open access destination for HCPs and pharma globally. Hi Jade, welcome back to another episode. How are you?
Thank you very much. Doing very well, thank you. Welcome back to yourself. You've just come back from a trip away.
I have. It was lovely. Had a little weekend break to Paris. A few of us have been doing that, I think.
Exactly, definitely. If anyone's looking for a holiday, get to Paris.
Yeah, it's the place to be.
Yeah.
Place to be. But Jade, I'd love it if you could tell our listeners what we have coming up today.
Of course, it's a good one. I've been looking forward to sharing it. We're going to be sitting in on a conversation I recently had with Christoph von der Goltz, and he's the Global Head of Medicine, Central Nervous System and Emerging Areas at Boehringer Ingelheim. We spoke about how to navigate setbacks in drug development to deliver breakthroughs in R&D, which is a topic he's very close to.
Sounds very interesting. But before we get into all of that, let's learn a little bit more about Christoph. So he has over 15 years of experience across a number of roles in pharma R&D, and he's actually a board-certified psychiatrist with over 10 years of experience in neurology and psychiatry as well.
Yes, that's right. He joined the pharma industry in 2012 with a job at Lundbeck before moving to Boehringer in 2022. In this episode, though, he shares some of the ins and outs of what happens when a drug candidate fails, including the deep reflection a company and its scientists have to do to move forward. So yeah, really interesting episode.
Cool topic. Let's get into it.
Let's do it. Hello, Christoph. How are you doing today?
Hi, Jade. I'm very well. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you for coming on to the show. I'm very much looking forward to talking with you today about an area that I know is very much important to you. But first of all, I'd love to learn a bit more about your career and your journey through the pharmaceutical industry. So I know that you started your career as a resident physician in neurology, but what lessons do you think you've taken from your time in specifically patient care that you can still use in your work today?
Yeah, no, thank you. I started in neurology actually and then changed to psychiatry. And what I learned in both areas is actually how much impact any severe health event can have on patients, but also on their loved ones. So having someone being newly diagnosed with Parkinson's or also experiencing a severe depressive episode in your family really is changing everything. And what's then the most striking for me, particularly in psychiatry, is actually how much better patients can get when they have access to healthcare and treatments. So if you have someone, for example, experiencing an acute psychotic episode after many months of paranoia and isolation at home, family is worried. It's very dramatic when they come to the hospital. And then once they're being taken care of mental health care professionals, of a good team, which are able to initiate treatment, the treatments the patient needs, like antipsychotic medications, the patients actually often get very much better very soon. You see it at them. They look better, are more calm, and actually find back to themselves. So that's a very rewarding experience in psychiatry.
I can imagine so, definitely. It must be really leave you with a warm feeling at the end of the day to know going to bed that you've really made a difference in someone's life, especially in an area such as mental health and psychiatry. Yeah, it's an aspect that I think touches all of us at some point in our lives. So yeah, it's great to see that you've taken that passion and that rewarding feeling through into your day at Boehringer.
Yeah, and you can help patients not only by providing good treatment, but also helping them understand what is actually happening. So I mean, often patients are diagnosed very late in the course of the disease, and providing some psychoeducation, helping them to understand what is behind it, is really a big relief for the patients and caregivers very often, but also really helping fighting stigma.
For sure, definitely. But obviously we know that breaking into that drug phase where you've actually launched a product and it is helping patients can be quite tricky. So I'd love to get some of your opinions on the drug development space. I know it's a huge investment across all global infrastructures, not just the European ones, but I'd love to sort of pick your brains a little about some of the most common reasons for failure in drug development, particularly when it does come to neuroscience and psychiatry.
Yeah, no, thank you for asking. I mean, that's obviously what keeps me very busy and very engaged. We picked a very tricky space. So in psychiatry, drugs are failing even more often than in other therapeutic areas like cardiovascular diseases, and that's it has many reasons. So first and foremost, it's the complexity of mental health conditions. So it involves a combination of genetic, environmental, neurobiological factors. So the brain is the most fascinating, but also the most complex structure we know. And I think safe to say we really understand only a very, very small part of it yet. But there are also some other factors which are more related to the clinical trials we have to do to get drugs or treatments tested and then approved by the regulators. And I think one important point to mention are the endpoints we have to use in psychiatry, because we have only endpoints which are objective, subjective measures. So we have to rely on what the patients report. For example, in depression or major depressive disorders, the rating scales work in a way that you have to ask the patient, let's say every other week at the site visits, how they did over the past 2 weeks, how they felt, and you have a list of items which you need to score. So it's a highly subjective report you get from the patients, unlike in other therapeutic areas where you have so-called hard endpoints like blood pressure or survival even, or some of these areas. So that makes it very difficult for us to find good and strong measures which robustly show a treatment effect. And it also comes with a very high variability. So it means we need very, very large patient samples or trial study sizes to really get to meaningful outcomes. So that's one part. Then diagnosing the patients come actually with the same problem. So also this is very subjective. There are no diagnostic biomarkers which tell us, does a patient really have depression or not? Depression can come with many different symptoms and can look very differently from patient to patient. Some patients are very agitated and aroused. Other patients are very, really low, tired, fatigued in their mood, and they actually suffer from the same condition, but experience different symptoms. So that makes it challenging to run these trials and to find the right patients for the trials.
Gosh, yeah, I can imagine. How do you see patient uptake of clinical trials in these areas? Do you generally think that patients are keen to get interested? Do you think they need a bit more information out there about what participating in the clinical trials can do to help them?
Yeah, patients are extremely keen to be part of clinical trials, which is actually also having a sad background that it's very difficult for patients living with psychiatric conditions to get access to treatment. So I think that makes it very interesting for patients to be part of a clinical trial. But obviously, it also makes it difficult for us to measure how much the treatment actually really helps the patient we want to test compared to the placebo response. Right? We have to, in all our trials, have to compare different study arms where patients get the actual treatment, and then there's also a study arm where patient just receives a placebo in order to show that the treatment we want to test is really working. And due to the lack of existing treatments, including a patient into a clinical trial is quite a big intervention in itself. So all of a sudden the patient is taken care of, gets thorough assessments by staff, by study nurses, by investigators, and it often leads to also quite a high unspecific treatment effect, which is more broadly called the placebo response, which makes it even more challenging to show treatment effects of our compounds.
Gosh, yeah, I can imagine. I suppose speaking of challenging aspects as well, when a drug candidate does unfortunately ultimately fail, how do you decide whether to sort of pivot or persist, or whether to abandon the project?
Yeah, that's a difficult question for us, obviously, to take this decision, because there has been a lot of investment, not only of money, but also time of the patients, time of the investigators, and also development from preclinical development to the actual drug tested in patient is 10 plus years. So first step is that we really need to take time to thoroughly analyze the results and carefully evaluate if there's any reason to believe that we should continue the research in different, in other ways. So it might be that we see a signal in the subpopulation where we have a better understanding why these patients may respond better than in the total population. But very often we also have to decide that our research efforts are better placed elsewhere. So it's really for us to be important to stay on the ultimate goal. This is to address from a patient perspective what can really address their unmet needs. And if we see, well, the treatment may help a little, but it's not strong enough to continue, then we have to stop development. That's a very disappointing and big event, not only for us, but also for the patients.
Yeah, for sure, definitely. I mean, as you say, it is such a disappointing situation where you've been working potentially for decades on these products and they do eventually have to be sort of
Exactly.
scrapped. Yeah. How do you maintain the morale of your R&D teams after all those years of working on a drug does ultimately fail?
So everyone knows that innovating in such complex conditions is not a quick fix, and it requires a long breath. And for the scientists in our group, and then for us as scientists, it's a true privilege to work in this space. So morale, I think this is not a challenge. But if I can use a more recent example of a bigger failure where we developed a compound eclipyrotin to be tested in cognitive impairment associated with schizophrenia. So patients with schizophrenia are known for more the acute psychotic symptoms where they experience, as I mentioned in the beginning, hallucinations and paranoia and delusions. But more than 80% of the patients experience also beyond stabilization cognitive impairment and symptoms which really affect their functioning, their way to work, but also the way they act in their family. And there are no treatments out there for this. So we picked it up as a huge unmet need. And because there are no treatments, there's very little awareness of it. So with the program we were running with these patients, we really brought it on the map and got broad attention to the issue. But at the same time, the trials unfortunately were reading out negative and showed very disappointing outcomes. So that's what is happening in this area, as I mentioned before. But at the same time, the dedication the teams were putting into this, understanding the unmet need, seeing patients suffering from this, is definitely enough to keep morale up. I mean, there's no lack of motivation and morale in the teams. This I can say for sure.
Very glad to hear that. I think there's always such a real good energy that goes into R&D teams where you know that you're working towards an end goal of just people living happier and healthier
Exactly.
lives.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's again, I think it goes back to that the wonderful warm feeling that you go back to at the end of the day, back that you used to feel when you were doing patient care.
Yeah, it's probably, yeah, you can probably compare it. I mean, now I became a doctor because I never wanted an office job, and now I'm sitting very often in an office. So it's a little bit ironic, but still I feel very close to patient care. I mean, we really look into what are the unmet needs, but also how can we help the patients. So what are really the areas where still some improvements for them are so important and lacking and not yet addressed by the current treatment. So definitely it is a similar feeling, but also different on many levels.
Yeah, for sure. I just think on a wider scale, maybe. No.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So obviously, people with mental health conditions, it's quite hard to get new treatments in for them. But why do you specifically think that this subset of patients need these new and innovative treatments? And is there a particular group that you think is most in need of them?
Yeah. No, thank you. I mean, maybe starting with looking a little bit at numbers here. So because it's actually, it's such a common problem worldwide. I mean, 1 in 8 people or 1 billion people are living or experiencing a mental health condition at some point in their life. And that doesn't even account for all the relatives and loved ones which are also affected by it, including also colleagues, employers and employees, etc. So, I mean, it's really, I think every other person at the end will get in touch one way or the other with a mental health condition during their lifetime. The number gets even more serious if one keeps the very early onset of these conditions in mind. So suicide is the most common reason the common reason of death in young people worldwide.
Wow.
That is really alarming, and that obviously gives a strong reason to increase activities, R&D activities, not only from our side, but also increase awareness and increase focus on helping people living with these conditions. So that's, yeah, reason enough, but there are also many reasons why it is so difficult. I mean, there's stigma. So often patients are diagnosed very late in the process. It's access to care. So often there is not only a lack of psychiatrists, but also a lack of good healthcare teams. And it's simply not on the highest priority of the list of policymakers and other stakeholders. So it's really a lot of work to do, which needs to be done together.
Yeah. Gosh, lots of work to be done indeed. The number one cause of death in young people, that is quite an alarming statistic.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you have any opinions on why it's necessarily affecting young people so much at the moment? I know, of course, there's the rise of social media, but there's also the neurological fact of the matter aspect that sometimes brains are wired differently.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it can be answered on many layers. So I think right now there is actually, fortunately, increasing awareness, particularly after COVID. There's a lot of talk about mental well-being and also young people not feeling well. But I think still conversations are, what is left out of the conversations is serious mental illness such as schizophrenia and major depressive disorder, and they start early in life because they are, simply in a developing brain. Let's say it comes through at an earlier point of life, as for instance something like dementia or Alzheimer's disease. So it's most of psychiatric conditions are really coming with an early onset, which probably can be explained on a biological basis, but then obviously also on genetic setup, life conditions, and the overall environment. So it's not something like cancer or cardiovascular diseases where you have to have, in most cases at least, lived a very long life before you develop something like this.
Of course, yeah, it's a very difficult area to be operating in. Do you have any sort of quick wins you think that could be possible to try and break the stigma in diagnosis that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, a few quick wins, but I think awareness and also psychoeducation helping not only patients but also societies to understand mental health conditions better, to understand the background. I think actually developing treatments is also a quick win, because if you show you can treat something, it also means that there is something, right, which is not like a individual character flaw or any other weakness others are looking at, but it's a serious condition which needs treatment and also response to treatment. So I really believe doing research in this space helps a lot to improve the situation, but we also need to look at it from societal level and create better understanding, better awareness, and first and foremost, better access to diagnose and treatment. I think that's probably the most important one.
Completely agree with you there. Wonderful. We've just about come to the end of the conversation, but I'd love to sort of get you to look to the horizon, look into the future, and ask you, what milestones do you hope to see in neurological care, let's say over the next decade?
Yeah, I mean, improving what I just mentioned, improving the rate of diagnosis and treatment. So that would be kind of an overall milestone, which would be so very important. But leading to this, I think creating a better understanding. We have now a lot of new methodologies which help us to understand the brain better and to become more precise in our approaches. So we follow a research approach which we call precision psychiatry, where we link symptoms the patients experience as part of their broader diagnosis, like major depressive disorder or also schizophrenia, where we focus on symptoms and link them to the underlying neurobiology. Then provides us better and more precise treatment targets. That's one approach, which is from a drug development perspective, very important. The other approach is to really create the understanding that only a pharmacological intervention is not doing the trick. So you really need to make sure that patients are taken care of in a broader way. So we, for instance, work with prescription digital therapeutics, which really help to provide psychosocial interventions, behavior interventions to patients, which could be combined with pharmacologic interventions, etc. But obviously, this does not stop there. So I think created an understanding that mental health care is something which needs to be brought, needs to be provided on a continuous way. And then if we can tap into this with new discoveries and new biologies which help us to provide more precise treatment targets, that would be, of course, wonderful, in combination with being able to measure it and to beat placebo response.
Very true. Getting past those subjective points there.
Exactly.
Amazing. Oh, thank you so much for the conversation today, Christoph. I've really enjoyed it, and hopefully.
Thank you. No, thanks very much for having me. It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, great interview, Jade. Thank you so much for sharing. As always, I'd love to know if you had a key takeaway.
Of course, yes. I really enjoyed the part of our conversation where we spoke about how a company has to pivot after a drug candidate fails. Ultimately, it is all about addressing unmet needs for patients, so it must be really disappointing for years of research to have to come to an end like that. It must take a lot of motivation to start again, but clearly can also be a really rewarding area of pharma to work in.
When it goes well, I imagine it incredibly is. I also really liked hearing Christoph mention what he was saying about the importance of awareness and education in breaking down stigma around psychiatric conditions. As he said, it's not a weakness, but a serious condition that needs to be treated. And hopefully we are going to see more research in future years and less of that stigma prevailing around these specific conditions.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, but I do think that brings us to the end of today's episode. Thank you so much again to Christoph for joining us, and thank you at home as always for listening.
Absolutely, do be sure to tune in next week, but until then, it is bye from us.
See you then.